My name is Deborah Whitaker, 65 years old. My whole life, I had lived to build a home and a career that I once thought would, in my old age, let me see my son carry on and cherish what his parents had worked so hard to create. But right at my own son's lavish wedding, I realized a painful truth in his eyes. I was no longer his mother. Only the shadow of someone who had once been useful. That night, the hotel garden glowed with lights. Long tables draped in white cloth. Roses and wine overflowing. Classical music floated in the air. Guests laughing. Chatting, everyone thought it was a dreamlike ball. It should have been the proudest day of my life. But instead, I was placed at a table in the kitchen with the catering staff. Before I could react, Chloe, my new daughter-in-law, looked at me and dropped a line loud enough for those around us to hear. "The help belongs in the kitchen." Her words were soft yet merciless, like a blade straight through my heart. A few chuckled. Some avoided my eyes. But no one spoke up. And Daniel, my son, the groom, just stood there, adjusting his cufflinks, then kept talking with his friends as if he hadn't heard a thing. In that moment, I understood more clearly than ever. Motherhood alone wasn't enough to keep a place in my son's heart. I sat upright, trying to appear calm. But inside was a storm. I set down my untouched glass of champagne. I pulled out my phone, and with a voice steady to the point of coldness, I called Robert Hayes, my attorney and longtime partner. I said only one short line: "Cancel the $40 million project Daniel is planning to announce tonight." One sentence. One decision, and it was enough to erase the glittering picture my son thought he had firmly in his grasp. Can you imagine a mother who once carried, raised, and sacrificed her whole life, only to be treated as a burden by her son and his new bride? If it were you humiliated in front of hundreds of guests, would you stay silent to save face? Or stand up to reclaim your dignity? I know each person's answer would be different. But for me, in that very second, I realized I had been silent for far too long. And silence only meant giving them permission to trample over me. That is why, right there in my son's wedding, I chose another path. A path of resolve, of reclaiming myself. And from here, a string of painful truths and sinister schemes would begin to surface. If this story makes you think of yourself or of a mother you know, share your thoughts in the comments. What would you do in my place? Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next chapters. There, I'll tell you about the years of sacrifice and the shocking moment I uncovered my son's true scheme. Because this story may not be mine alone. After the moment I stood up in the middle of my son's wedding, my mind was pulled back into the past. Images from decades ago appeared so vividly that I felt as if I were still living in them. I remembered my youth. Those early days in my 20s. When my hands were still unskilled, but my heart burned with passion. I once thought I would have a normal life, like other women, a stable home, a husband by my side, children growing up in laughter. But my husband left too soon. A sudden heart attack took him away when Daniel was only 3 years old. On the night of his funeral, I held my little boy tightly in my arms, watching the men in black lower the coffin into the cold ground. That night, I swore to myself no matter what it took, I would raise my son well, and not just to survive. I would build for him a future brighter than anyone could imagine. That day, while many other women chose to turn away from their careers and settle down, I stepped into a thorny path, starting my own architecture firm. I remember the small apartment where the two of us lived, with a kitchen barely big enough for one old round table. It was there that I spent countless nights sitting over blueprints, my left hand soothing Daniel in his sleep, my right hand holding a pencil, sketching trembling yet determined lines. I had no office, no staff, only a child and a will that refused to break. Daniel grew up surrounded by drawings, perspective boards, and the smell of freshly printed paper. I still remember him toddling around, his bare feet leaving dusty prints on the floor, then climbing onto a chair to hug my leather briefcase. He called it Mommy's secret suitcase to his young eyes. Inside that case was a treasure, something magical that allowed his mother to create buildings, shops, schools. I laughed, kissed his messy hair, and said, "That's right, Daniel. It's Mommy's magic suitcase. One day, I'll build an entire world for you." Those years, I don't know how I made it through. There were times when I had only enough money left for a loaf of bread and a carton of milk. Yet I still made sure my son had a warm meal before school. By day, I ran everywhere looking for clients. By night, I worked until dawn. I once took Daniel with me to a temporary rented office, letting him sleep on an old sofa while I met with partners. I had to turn down many parties, many dates, just to make sure that fragile little firm didn't collapse. And I succeeded. Not immediately, not overnight, but with small steps, one hard-won contract at a time, one drop of sweat at a time. My name gradually began to be mentioned in the architecture world. I designed my first houses, then a small hospital, then a large hotel. People started to know Whitaker Designs. They called me the woman who built from ashes. I didn't care about the title. I only knew I had kept the promise I made on that funeral night. Daniel would have a bright future. Those years, Daniel was my greatest comfort. He would run to hug me after days when I was exhausted, whispering, "Mom, I'm proud of you." Each time I heard that, all the fatigue melted away. I thought that was enough. But time passed, and my son grew up. He went to college, then earned his MBA at a prestigious school. I was proud. Of course, I spent nearly all of my savings to support him. I told him, "Go, study, see the wide world out there. I'll take care of everything here." But when Daniel came back, I noticed a change. For the first time, during a meeting with business partners, he called me Deborah instead of Mom. At first I thought he was joking, or trying to sound mature. But gradually, it became a habit. In front of others, I was no longer his mother, but Deborah Whitaker, the founder of the company, the name he used to gain credibility with investors. At first, I tried not to mind. I told myself, maybe my son was just trying to keep things professional. But over time, I realized I had become some sort of brand asset. My face was printed in magazines to illustrate what they called a legacy. My name was mentioned as a guarantee. But my voice slowly disappeared. I still remember one evening, when I reminded Daniel about a new project and cautioned him about a partner. He just gave a faint smile and said, "Deborah, times have changed. You should let us handle it." Deborah. Once again, not Mom. My whole life, I had given to nurture, to love, to sacrifice. Yet one day, I realized I was nothing more than a name decorating the company sign. Gone was the tight embrace of a little boy. Gone was the pure look of pride in his eyes. All that was left were calculating glances and a cold distance. So, sitting at that wedding, assigned to a table meant for catering staff, I didn't just see the humiliation of the present. I saw an entire lifetime of sacrifice buried. All those long nights over blueprints, the last coins spent to send him to school. All my love and pride now repaid with a seat in the kitchen and a careless look from the very child I gave birth to. I once thought that my sacrifices, the years I spent building everything with my own hands, and would be enough for my son and those around him to understand that I deserved respect. But time and again, I was pushed to the sidelines silently, bitterly. I still remember the day I walked into the company's new showroom. On the white walls hung the designs I had poured my heart into for years. It was the collection that bore my name, Whitaker Heritage. That collection wasn't just drawings, it was a part of my life. Patterns, inspired by the wooden house where I grew up. Intricate details, recalling the afternoons I sat with Daniel over sketches. As he scribbled crayons onto my renderings, every piece was part of my memory, part of my heart. But as I walked closer, I froze. The plaque on the wall now carried a different name, New Heritage. No trace of me remained. No acknowledgement. No mention at all. I stood there, my hand trembling slightly, staring at my own designs presented as if they came from nowhere. I turned to a young staff member and asked, "Who decided to rename this collection?" He looked uneasy, then replied quietly, Director Daniel and Miss Chloe wanted to create a fresher, more modern image. I said nothing more. I just nodded, trying to stay composed. But inside, a cold emptiness opened wide. My name? My effort. The memories of a lifetime all erased with one decision under the banner of modernization. Not long after, I heard they were hosting a lavish brunch called Legacy at the very mansion where I once lived and built my career. I wasn't invited. When friends asked why I wasn't there, I realized the guest list had been arranged long ago, and the name Deborah Whitaker was completely absent. I remember that morning. I sat alone in my study, looking out the window into the garden. Across the city, they were raising glasses, toasting to the Whitaker family's legacy. Yet the one who built it all had been left out. I thought Daniel would at least mention me in his greetings. But no, it was all about the new faces. The connections Chloe so skillfully curated. Another time, during a meeting, Chloe sat with her legs crossed, her cold eyes sweeping over me before she let out a faint, mocking laugh. "Deborah, do you really think your outdated style still fits this market? For a modern brand, we need a younger, more dynamic face. Your time is over." I looked straight into her eyes, silent. I knew if I spoke, my rage would break loose. I didn't want her to see me weak, not even for a moment. But deep inside, I felt my heart shattering. Those sarcastic remarks, those times I was excluded from my own family's story, they were like small knives, slicing away pieces of my dignity. I tried convincing myself it was unintentional, that Daniel was just too busy, that Chloe was still too young to understand. But no, it was deliberate. A pattern repeated over and over. A process designed to erase me from the place that was rightfully mine. One afternoon, when I returned to the old office to collect some files, I stopped in front of a photograph on the wall. It was Daniel, on his graduation day. He wore a deep blue gown, his smile radiant, holding his diploma. I stood beside him, my eyes glowing with pride. I remember vividly how he hugged me and whispered, "Mom, it's all thanks to you." I had believed those words, carried them as comfort for years. But now, looking back, my eyes grew wet. The joy of that day had turned into bitter sorrow. I could see clearly the distance between the boy in that photo and the cold man he had become. A distance not measured in years, but in betrayal and neglect. I stood still for a long time before that photo. The room was silent. Only the ticking clock breaking the air. In the reflection of the glass, I saw my own face, the face of a woman who had endured too much sacrifice, now questioning if she still had a place in her own family. It was no longer just a fleeting disappointment. It was a bitter truth seeping into every breath. From the pride I once carried, now only the stark reality remained. I was being erased from the very picture I had painted. After all, the relentless humiliations, I knew I could no longer stay still. My whole life I had been used to enduring. But it was time to learn how to reclaim truth and dignity. I chose not to be loud, not to argue, but to quietly, step by step, take back the power that had always been mine. I began by calling Robert Hayes. His voice came steady on the other end of the line, deep and firm as it had always been through the years. I spoke plainly. Without hesitation, Robert. Prepare the papers. Remove Daniel from the trust. There was a moment of silence. I imagined him tapping his fingers against the polished wood of his old office desk. Then Robert asked softly, "Are you ready for the consequences?" Deborah, I closed my eyes. In my mind appeared the image of little Daniel, hugging his school bag, smiling brightly, and calling me, Mom. But that image was too far gone. I answered, I was ready, the night he left me sitting in the kitchen. Robert said nothing more. Only sighed. I'll have it done before the day is over. That was the first step. With just one signature, one amended clause. Daniel lost the authority he had thought was his by default. But it didn't end there. I still remember the moment Evelyn Moore, my loyal assistant who had stood by me for 30 years, walked into the office and set down a thick folder in front of me. Her eyes carried their usual careful light. Evelyn never spoke much. But when she did, every word cut through the silence like a blade. Deborah. Do you know how much Daniel and Chloe's wedding registry is worth? I looked at the stack of papers. A long list of extravagant gifts, a $15,000 dining set, a honeymoon trip close to $100,000, a diamond-studded watch worth $30,000. All of them listed under gifted by Deborah Whitaker. My body went cold. I never signed a single dollar for this. Evelyn nodded. Chloe fabricated it. The payments are still pending. If you don't stop it, you'll lose hundreds of thousands. I gripped the edge of the table. Once again, my name, my work, had been twisted into their display of vanity. I looked up at Evelyn. Block it. Immediately. She nodded. I've drafted the documents. It only needs your signature. I signed. And with that signature, I shattered Chloe's seemingly flawless scheme. But the strongest blow was still to come. It happened right on the wedding day. When Chloe was basking in camera flashes and cheers. I remember it vividly. Evelyn walked into the bridal suite, the vast room where Chloe sat in her gown. The dress flowing across the floor. Surrounded by makeup artists, photographers, and bridesmaids. On Chloe's finger sparkled a sapphire ring. One that had once belonged to my grandmother. It was a 3-generation heirloom. The Whitaker family ring. One I had never permitted anyone outside our bloodline to wear. Evelyn stood tall. Her calm voice cutting through the laughter in the room. Miss Chloe. Deborah has requested I take back the family heirloom right now. The whole room froze. The makeup artist stopped. Mascara wand hanging mid-air. A bridesmaid's mouth dropped open. Chloe whipped her head around, eyes wide. Then she let out a sharp, mocking laugh that rang hollow. This is the ring I'm wearing on my wedding day. Surely she doesn't want to ruin the whole event. Evelyn didn't blink. Mrs. Whitaker has been very clear. The ring must be returned. The air thickened. Chloe's face flushed as she tried to keep her voice calm, though her lips trembled. I'll return it after the ceremony. Evelyn shook her head. No. Right now. I stood outside in the hall, hearing the murmurs, feeling each tense second drag by. 1 minute. 2 minutes, then the door swung open. Evelyn walked out, the sapphire ring secure in a velvet pouch in her hand, her gaze steady. She gave me a small nod. I took the ring, closing it tightly in my palm. Cold to the touch, yet to me, it was the first light piercing the darkness. Inside, Chloe had surely lost face before her entire team, and for the first time in years, I felt I had reclaimed a piece of justice. That evening, while music still roared and guests still raised glasses, I sat quietly in the shadows, turning the old ring in my hand. I spoke to no one, sought no praise or applause. I only knew one thing once I began. There was no turning back. From that very moment, I chose the path of counterattack. No noise, no shouting, only silent, steady steps, and each strike aimed at where they least expected. I still remember that night clearly. Right after I took back the family heirloom ring from Chloe, the wedding had moved on to the dinner reception, guests raising glasses, laughter mingling with the sound of violins and the chime of crystal. Outside, the garden shimmered with lights, glowing like a painting. But inside me there was only an indescribable chill. I walked along the hotel's long corridor, my high heels striking against the marble floor. I wasn't looking for anything. Only a moment of quiet. Passing by the rooms reserved for the bride and groom's families, I suddenly heard whispers drifting out from a slightly open door. I froze. Daniel's voice. "My son, Mother will never hand everything over to us. Chloe, she's too stubborn." Chloe's voice cut in, sharp and cold as steel. "Daniel, you're too naive. We don't need your mother's consent. Don't you know the law? Once she's deemed incapable of managing, all authority transfers automatically." Daniel lowered his voice, tinged with unease. "But my mother, she's not senile. She's still sharper than most." Chloe gave a soft laugh, the sound making my skin crawl. "Sharp, at 75, all it takes is one slip, a confused answer in front of a lawyer or doctor, a forgotten pill, a missed appointment. Who do you think the court will side with? Trust me. One small piece of evidence, and we'll have it all." My heart clenched with every beat. I stood motionless in the hall, my hand unconsciously gripping the ring on my finger. My own son, the boy I had raised with my life, now conspiring with his wife to strip me of guardianship. This wasn't neglect. This was betrayal. Daniel was silent for a moment, then whispered, "But what if Mother finds out?" Chloe answered instantly. Without hesitation, "She won't. She still trusts you. Daniel, that's her weakness. Just play the dutiful son a little longer. When the time is right, everything will be ours." I bit my lip. Tears welled up, but I forced them back. I would not cry. Not now. In that moment, memories flooded me. Daniel taking his first steps, stumbling in the yard, then running to cry in my arms. Daniel, holding his diploma, eyes shining as he thanked me. Those memories shattered like glass on stone. Before me stood not the boy I once knew, but a calculating man, letting his wife insult me, and himself aiding in the scheme to push me out of the home I had bled to build. I stood there for a long time, then slowly stepped back, silent as a shadow. My trembling hand fumbled inside my small handbag. I carried a recorder, meant for work notes. That night, it became my only weapon to preserve the truth. I pressed the button, and their voices were captured, word for word, undeniable. When I left the corridor, my steps were heavy, but my mind grew clear. I knew I could no longer think of Daniel as before. My son was not only careless, he had chosen to side with the one who sought to destroy me. The next morning, I went to Robert Hayes. His office looked the same. Shelves stacked with files, the large window overlooking the park. Robert studied me, his deep, measured eyes as if he already sensed something grave. "Deborah, what's happened?" I placed the recorder on the wooden desk and pressed play. In the silent room, Daniel and Chloe's voices filled the air. Chloe's venomous words, Daniel's complicit silence, each cut through the stillness like a knife. Robert sat still, his hands clasped together. When the recording ended, he lifted his gaze, heavy with weight. "I'm sorry, Deborah, but at least now you have evidence." I nodded, my voice low but resolute. Keep it safe. One day, I will need it. Robert gave a quiet nod. He didn't ask further. Didn't offer hollow comfort. We both understood this evidence was the only thread holding me steady for the battle to come. That night, I sat alone in my empty room, the lamplight casting pale yellow on the walls. I looked around at the neatly framed family photos Daniel as a boy. Daniel, on his wedding day. Memories that once made me smile. Now, each photo cut into me like a blade. I had raised a child with love, only to watch him grow into ambition and betrayal. I didn't cry. I would not allow myself to cry again. Tears would not protect me. Nor could they protect this home. I understood, more than ever, that from now on, I had to be sharper than I had ever been. For many, that shock would have been the end. But for me, it was only the beginning. Because if they wanted to steal my legacy, I would show them I will not be erased so easily. From the day I discovered Daniel and Chloe's scheme, I understood that if I wanted to survive, I couldn't fight back with anger or shouting. They were used to seeing me as an old mother, easily overlooked. Then I would let them think so. I chose silence, not the silence of surrender, but the silence of someone calculating each move. I began reappearing at tea parties, at private brunches of the upper class where news traveled faster than any newspaper. For a long time, I had stayed away from such gatherings, partly out of exhaustion, partly because I thought I had already passed the reins to the next generation. But now, I knew. Those seemingly frivolous places were, in truth, the most crucial battleground. Mrs. Lillian Davenport was the first to send me an invitation. She was the image of old aristocracy, silver hair, always neatly pinned, a string of pearls at her neck. Every step radiating quiet authority. In New York society, a single frown from her could shake a family's reputation. That Sunday morning, I arrived at her home. The drawing room glowed with golden sunlight from tall windows. The table laid with pastries and steaming Earl Grey. Around it sat familiar women, wives of politicians, widows of business magnates, gallery owners. Their eyes studied me with curiosity, edged with caution. Mrs. Davenport clasped my hand. Her husky voice clear. Deborah, it has been so long since you returned. We still spoke of you. But no one expected you to show up after everything that has happened. I smiled and gracefully pulled out a chair. I needed no explanations. My presence alone sent the message I was still here. I had never left. Throughout the gathering, I said little. I let them chatter. Let rumors seep into the air like freshly poured tea. I knew well that if just one of them mentioned the rumor that I had cut Daniel from the trust, the whole table would stir. And indeed, it happened. A woman beside me whispered, just loud enough for all to hear. I heard Deborah remove Daniel from the family fortune. Is it true? Every gaze turned toward me. I took a sip of tea, set the cup down gently, and smiled calmly. Rumors may travel faster than the wind, but I've always trusted truth. And truth is not always meant to be announced. The room buzzed with murmurs. I neither confirmed nor denied. That ambiguity made them even more certain it was true. And when a rumor is left hanging by the person at its center, it becomes truth in society's eyes. Within weeks, the same question echoed at every event I attended. Each time, I only smiled and repeated the same reply. I didn't need to state it outright. They understood. And they understood exactly as I wanted that Daniel no longer had any claim to the Whitaker fortune. That Chloe was nothing more than an outsider who never belonged to this legacy. The rumor spread quickly. I was told that at a fundraising gala, Chloe arrived in a blazing red gown, forcing a radiant smile. But behind her, whispers rippled. So, the Whitaker legacy isn't theirs after all. they said. Chloe's face froze for a split second. She tried to stretch her lips into a smile, but her eyes faltered, awkward and stiff. I pictured the scene and felt a strange calm inside. I hadn't needed to raise my voice, hadn't needed to confront her directly. All it took was society's whispers, passed from one socialite to another, to strip Chloe of what she craved most: validation. Daniel, I knew, had surely heard the rumor, yet he remained silent. He didn't dare face me directly. Because in this society, silence can weigh heavier than any accusation. In later gatherings, Mrs. Davenport often gave me a testing look. Once, when nearly everyone had left, she leaned in and spoke softly. Deborah, you understand this game better than anyone. But remember, silence itself is a weapon. Don't swing it too hard, or you may break the very sword you hold. I only nodded. She was right. I didn't need to tear everything down at once. I only needed to move step by step, letting Daniel and Chloe lose their place in society's eyes. And indeed, the power of that silence was greater than I imagined. Each forced smile from Chloe in public, each averted glance from Daniel in gatherings, was proof that I had chosen the right path. I was no longer the old woman pushed aside. I was returning not with shouting, but with the kind of quiet that commanded fear. In high society, rumors travel faster than the first summer breeze. I had used silence to plant whispers, letting Daniel and Chloe taste the bitterness of watchful eyes. But I knew that wasn't enough. I needed a move that would truly stun them, a strike they could neither predict, block, nor undo. For years, alongside the company's work, I had quietly built a private investment network of my own. I called them my ghost portfolios, secret holdings beyond Daniel's reach, even beyond the board's oversight. I never boasted, never filed them in reports. I simply let them grow, like seeds buried deep in the earth. Small, real estate deals, shares in startups, a few overlooked licensing contracts. Modest, silent, but steady. That was the true foundation of my fortune. One Monday morning, I sat in my old office, sunlight pouring through the window onto the wooden desk piled with files. Evelyn stood beside me, calmly handing me each document, each contract to sign. With every stroke of my pen, an investment was withdrawn, a deal sold off, funds redirected into my private accounts. Evelyn whispered, low enough for only me to hear, once these disappear, Daniel won't be able to explain anything to his partners. I gave a slight nod, my heart unshaken. I had waited for this day far too long. Weeks later, Robert told me Daniel had shown up to a meeting, pale-faced. A real estate project he had once bragged about to investors had suddenly vanished from the company's portfolio. The contract had been sold to an independent fund, one I had quietly orchestrated. Another deal, a design licensing project Chloe had used to promote her image, was suddenly transferred away as well. At one meeting, a partner's words cut sharp. I thought this was your ace. Daniel. Where did it go, they said? Daniel stammered, cheeks flushed, unable to answer. His shine, the man once hailed as the brilliant heir, began to crack. Meanwhile, while Daniel stumbled, I was quietly preparing another weapon. I used the money from those ghost portfolios to establish the Whitaker Foundation. I didn't choose a lavish office or a grand launch. I sat in a small room, signed the founding documents, and decided that from now on, a large share of my wealth would go to women and children, the ones like I once was, forced to rise from ashes. The day the press reported it, I was sitting in my living room, morning sunlight spilling through the curtains. Evelyn brought me the paper, her voice laced with barely restrained excitement. Deborah. It made the front page. I looked at the bold headline, Matriarch redirects 40 million to charity. Son excluded. I read the line again and again. Not to boast, but to make sure this time the whole world knew I had chosen my own path. The news hit like a bomb. At dinner parties. In company hallways. At society's morning coffee tables. The whispers spread. Deborah really cut Daniel out. The fortune is going to charity. Chloe has nothing left. I heard that at an evening gala. As the news broke, Chloe appeared in a dazzling gown, but her face was stiff. A woman nearby, without lowering her voice, said bluntly, "So, the Whitaker legacy isn't theirs after all." The table burst into light laughter, cold and cutting. Chloe pressed her lips tight, forcing a smile. But her eyes faltered, uneasy and rigid. I pictured it and felt an odd calm. I hadn't needed harsh words, hadn't confronted her directly. Society's whispers alone had stripped her of what she craved most: recognition. Daniel, I knew, must have heard. Yet he stayed silent. He dared not confront me. In this world, silence sometimes weighs heavier than accusation. Chloe, on the other hand, couldn't hide her fury. Friends told me she had exploded at a private party, smashing a wine glass and screaming that I had ruined everything. For Chloe, social prestige was breath itself, her only power. Losing it was like suffocating. I sat in my quiet room, listening as the stories reached me, and felt no triumph, only a deep sadness. This counterstrike wasn't for revenge. It was to remind them the Whitaker legacy was never a costume to wear and discard. It was my sweat, my tears, my blood, and if I had to choose, I would rather see that legacy serve those who truly need it than fall into the hands of people who see it only as a tool to polish their pride. 3 weeks after the press simultaneously reported that I had founded the Whitaker Foundation and moved $40 million into charity, Daniel came to me. At that time, the news of me cutting my son off from every financial privilege was still the subject of whispers at cocktail parties and in the pages of business journals. Chloe had disappeared from public view, and Daniel was quieter than ever. I wasn't surprised that eventually he had to knock on his mother's door. That afternoon, around 4:30, the New York sky was heavy gray. I was sitting in the small living room of my suburban house, my cup of Earl Grey long gone cold, when Evelyn stepped in. Her face grew tense. Her voice lowered. "Deborah, Daniel is standing at the gate. He wants to see you." I set the teacup down on the table, my hand pausing for a moment. For a split second, I pictured the little blonde-haired boy in a blue t-shirt, running into my arms after spilling a bottle of milk on the floor. But I quickly pulled myself back to the present. I only nodded. "Let him in." The door opened. Daniel walked in. Chloe not at his side. No fitted suit. No gleaming watch like in the glossy magazine photos. Instead, a gaunt man in a wrinkled shirt. Dark circles under sleepless eyes. He stood there a long while, saying nothing, as though struggling to remember how to call me what he once did. Finally, he spoke, his voice hoarse and trembling. "Mom?" I looked up. It had been years since I'd heard that word from him, but this time, instead of warmth, it pierced my chest. Daniel sat in the chair across from me, his hands clasped tightly together, then suddenly broke down. Tears streaked his thin cheeks as he choked out, "I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. I just didn't think you'd care. I thought you wouldn't notice. That you wouldn't mind." I looked straight into his eyes. My voice was slow, steady, every word heavy as stone. "It's not that you thought I wouldn't mind. You thought I couldn't feel. You assumed I didn't know pain. And that was your greatest mistake." He dropped his head. The room fell silent. I heard the wall clock strike 4:45. Only Daniel's muffled sobs blended with the ticking second hand. After a while, he pulled from his coat pocket a worn piece of paper. Its edges were crumpled. The color yellowed with age. His hands shook as he placed it on the table and slid it toward me. I found this in an old drawer. Do you remember? I looked down. A childish crayon drawing. A woman in an apron, holding a tray of cookies. Below it, a crooked line of words. My mommy is a boss. The O in boss had been replaced with a bright red heart. I froze. It was indeed Daniel's drawing from when he was 7. The memory returned in full, a spring afternoon in our tiny kitchen. Daniel nibbling cookies while scribbling, then rushing to me, wrapping his arms around my waist, proudly holding up the drawing like a trophy. My chest tightened. I ran my finger across the raised crayon marks, feeling every uneven line. My heart wanted to melt, but then I inhaled deeply, folded the drawing gently, and pushed it back toward my son. I remember. Of course I remember. But the woman in that picture no longer lives in the house where you erased her. Daniel froze. His face stiffened, then broke apart. He buried his face in his hands, sobbing uncontrollably, his cries filling the still room. I sat quietly, neither moving toward him nor reaching out my hand, because I knew these tears were not of true remorse, but of realizing the price he had to pay. I looked at him, my heart heavy. No triumph, no anger, only a deep sorrow. Because the bond between mother and child doesn't break in a single day. It frays from countless small cuts, year after year. And once the cord is severed, no apology can stitch it back together. Daniel sat there, at head bowed, clutching the old drawing. I knew then, as clearly as I had ever known anything, that between my son and me, from that day forward, there would be no way back. Just over a month after the day Daniel came to me in desperation, I made the most important decision of my life. It was a Monday morning, exactly 8 o'clock. When I walked into the company's grand boardroom, the place that had been the seat of Whitaker family power for decades, sunlight streamed through the tall glass windows, reflecting off the polished wooden table. Every face on the board of directors was present, tense with anticipation. I wore a simple cream-colored suit. No extravagant jewelry. Only a small old pin on my lapel, a keepsake from the day I landed my very first major project. Evelyn sat at the far end of the table, her gaze calm but steady, a silent reminder that I was not alone. I set the folder of documents on the table and spoke in a deep, clear voice. Today, I am not here to discuss strategy or approve budgets. I am here to announce a final decision. I am withdrawing completely from Whitaker Design. A wave of murmurs spread. I raised my hand for silence and continued. All of my remaining assets, including company stakes and real estate tied to the Whitaker name, will be transferred into the Whitaker Foundation. From this day forward, it will all serve women and children in need. I saw stunned faces, widened eyes, even nods of admiration, but that no longer mattered. I wasn't doing this for praise, nor to prove anything. I was doing it for myself and for the freedom I had spent a lifetime to finally reclaim. That afternoon, I stood before dozens of cameras at the press conference in the Foundation's new headquarters. Rows of journalists packed the seats, flashes bursting endlessly. I drew a deep breath, stepped onto the wooden podium, and looked directly at the crowd. I know you all want to hear why I chose to walk away from the company after 40 years of building it. My voice was steady, without a tremor. But the truth is simple. Legacy is not money. It is not marble walls or sketches hanging in museums. I paused, letting my eyes sweep across the room. Legacy is not wealth. It's who keeps your name safe when you're not in the room. Legacy is not about bank accounts. but about who will hold your name with respect, even when you're no longer here. The room fell silent, broken only by the clicking of cameras. I knew those words would be on tomorrow's front pages. But to me, they were not a public declaration. They were a vow to myself. After everything I had endured. The next day, the headlines flooded in Whitaker matriarch steps down. Redirects entire fortune to foundation. Deborah Whitaker leaves family business. Builds legacy beyond wealth. And on the front page of a major financial paper, bold letters read, "Son excluded from Whitaker legacy." While I faced the press with composure, on the other side, Daniel was nearly erased from the company's board. A week after the press conference, his name was removed from the speakers list at the annual design conference. Investors who once courted him now turned their backs. At parties, I heard. Some only shrugged when Daniel approached, treating him as little more than a shadow in a brightly lit room. As for Chloe, she vanished completely. No more radiant photos in magazines. No more parties flaunting gowns. I was told she tried to appear once at a charity gala. But the scornful looks and whispered words, "So the Whitaker legacy isn't theirs after all," drove her out early, never to return. One evening, as I sat in my small lakeside home, in golden lamplight spilling across the room, Evelyn brought me a fresh stack of papers. She set them down with a faint smile. "Deborah, did you see? Someone called you the woman who redefined legacy." I didn't answer right away. I looked out the window at the still lake. The moon stretched across it like a mirror. In that reflection, I saw a woman no longer battling, no longer straining to hold on. A woman who had dared to step out from the shadow of her own family and paint a new image for herself. Daniel, my son, now left with nothing but regret. I knew it. Because Robert once told me he came to the law office, and voice trembling, asking if there was any way to overturn the will. But Robert only stayed silent and shook his head. I felt no joy in hearing it. But no fresh pain either, because I understood his regret was no longer mine to carry. As for me, I had chosen my own path, a journey with no more power struggles, no more tense boardrooms, no more battles. Instead, there were shy little girls receiving scholarships, single mothers given a chance to learn a trade, handwritten letters arriving at the foundation, filled with hesitant but grateful words. I realized that sometimes, to truly find yourself, you must dare to give everything up. And I had done just that. On a late autumn morning, the lake in front of my small house was so still, I could hear the wind brushing gently through the golden-tinted maple leaves. The simple wooden house, with only Evelyn and me inside, had never felt more peaceful. No more phones ringing endlessly. No more glittering parties, where smiles mask calculating eyes. Only the chirping of sparrows on the porch and the faint scent of hot coffee drifting from the small kitchen. Evelyn brewed me a cup of tea, set it down on the wooden table, and quietly stepped away, leaving me alone by the wide window. The golden morning light spread across the lake. Shimmering like a vast mirror, I drew in a deep breath, letting it dissolve into the air, and allowed memories to return. I once believed that motherhood was the strongest bond in life. I thought that by giving all my love, sacrificing my entire life, I would be met with respect in return. But in the end, I learned this love, if not nurtured with respect, becomes a chain. It holds you captive in suffering, in blind hope, and turns you into the shadow of yourself. I gazed out at the lake, my voice rising not loud, but clear and steady, as if telling my story back to life itself. I once thought that motherhood was eternal, but love, if not respected, becomes a chain. And I broke that chain, not for revenge, but to reclaim freedom. I took a sip of tea, The faint bitterness on my tongue slowly softened into a warm sweetness. I smiled. In the lake's reflection, I no longer saw the woman pushed away from the table, mocked by her daughter-in-law, betrayed by her own son's schemes. I saw a new Deborah, lighter, prouder, and at peace. Outside, the golden sunlight poured down, spreading across the water as if opening a new path. I knew another chapter of life had just begun. A chapter without resentment, without unhealed wounds, only peace. And the freedom I had spent a lifetime to claim. I sat quietly, smiling, letting the light cover me. And for the first time in many years, I felt as serene as the lake before my eyes. I share this story not to complain or place blame, but to tell of a journey where perhaps many of us, at some point in life, may glimpse a reflection of ourselves, because every family carries its cracks, its unspoken truths. I want to ask you, the ones listening to me right now, if one day, the person you love most is also the one who hurts you the deepest, what would you choose? Would you continue to endure in silence just to preserve a fragile shell of peace? Or would you stand up to hold on to your dignity and your freedom? There is no absolute right answer. But each response, I believe, reveals something about the strength and choices that live within every heart. If this story has touched you, I hope you will leave your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me, would you choose to remain silent and endure? Or to break the chains and be free? I want to listen, to read your voices, because I believe that through this dialogue, we will realize we are not alone. And if you wish to continue walking with me, hearing more stories about family, about the bitter but powerful lessons life brings, please follow the channel. There are many more stories waiting to be told, stories that may bring you to tears, but may also make you smile, because within them, you may see yourself. I'll see you again in the next stories, stories not only about loss, but also about hope, about the peace we all deserve.